And our first session is a logical continuation of this talk. We're going to discuss BRICS-net. Is it a new billion or a new bubble? But before we hear the opinions of our experts, let's look how people in the streets see the role of the internet for the economy, both of their own country and worldwide.
Свой интернет-магазин.
ЖКХ через Киви.
Я по старинке.
Работа.
PayPal.
Пожертвовал Википедии.
Меня бесит реклама.
Ролик за 20 баксов.
Freelance.ru.
2 секунды, и деньги у тебя.
Amazon.
eBay.
Купоны.
Скачиваешь бесплатно, если понравилось, платишь. 30 человек, и все работают из разных регионов.
Продаю интернет-магазины через интернет.
Взломали карточку. Всю отчетность сдаю, и никаких проблем.
Заработал покером.
Рекламирует то, что нужно.
Производим, продаем. штангенциркуль.ру.
Мнение разнообразно.
Well, the opinions are diverse, and I have the pleasure to introduce Sergei Gureyev, rector of the Russian School of Economics and the moderator of our first session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, and I'd like to invite the participants of our first panel discussion, Mike Walsh, Jacques Bugin, and Leonid Boguslavsky. We're going to talk about BRICS-net. Mike.
CEO of Tomorrow and the author of the bestseller Futuretainment. Jacques is co-lead of McKinsey Technology Initiative and director at McKinsey, also head of high-tech and telecom practice at McKinsey. And Leonid Boguslavsky probably doesn't need an introduction in this audience, one of the most successful Russian venture investors, CEO and owner of Runet Limited Holdings. We are going to talk about the role of the internet in BRICS and the role of BRICS and other companies, other countries like BRICS in the digital world. And with that, I will ask Jacques probably to provide the main findings, the key points from the recent McKinsey Global Institute's report on the BRICS-net. Okay. Jacques, please.
So thanks for having me, and thanks for Google to having this great Big Ten session. A few things about the question about the billion versus the bubble. First of all, I've been in McKinsey for about 22 years, I think. And guess what? The innovation at that stage, when I came first in the office, was to have a voicemail system. Okay? At that time, there was no mobile at all, and there was no internet. It took pretty much, and at that time I was in the US, in '95, to get both a mobile and finally the first internet dial-up connection. So again, in roughly less than 20 years, the world has evolved quite dramatically. And I guess the point I want to make here is that time flies, and very quickly what we call aspiring countries, or BRIC countries, whether they are at the stage of leapfrogging or not, I don't think is the right question. We all know it will happen. That's the first observation. Second observation, before I go to some of the figures, I like the way you phrase the topic, bubbles. Bubbles are pretty much market bubbles, much more than anything else. And the fact that there are at least up to 2 billion of people being internet users is not a bubble. It's a fact. It's a platform. And from that platform, obviously, the business model can be created. And guess what? Even from a pure historical economic point of view, it's surprising to see how resilient companies on the internet are quite, so how resilient they are. Take the classical example of the 1930s, when for the first time we used rubber to do tie for an emerging industry called the car industry. Well, guess what? There were pretty much 15 to 20,000 companies trying to to manufacture ties. After 10 years, the bubble exploded, and we came to in possibly 10 companies, and today possibly 5 companies worldwide basically selling and manufacturing ties. Now, if you look at the internet, if you take 10 years or even 15 years ago, the index of these words the male RU of these words, the V contact of this word were existing and still existing. And in fact, the proportion of companies existing is still quite big. So this being said, that means the billion is there. The bubble is not a bubble. It's actually a platform. The question is that how big is it? Thanks to cooperation with Google, we try to look at these numbers and try to get to three facts. Fact number one is that in economic activity, what's the money behind that? And from a pure value-added perspective, our finding is that today, the economy, again, in added value, is about 400 billion. Now, 400 billion, if you assume half of that is profit, is 200 billion today. Now, if you make from that a classical multiple of the internet economy and be decent about that, let's say a 20 multiple, we call it a 4 trillion, market cap evolution, of which pretty much 70% is the break. So it's a big potential numbers of profit making. Now the question is, who benefit from that? On one way, there is the supply chain, i.e. the Yandex of these words, Google and so on. On the other side, and it's something that is also quite staggering, is the people, the companies using those technology to benefit the users. And the staggering fact is that despite the internet being something we do every day, 70% of the value comes from usage of the technology, but pretty much barely 10 to 20% of the companies are using extensively the web technology to benefit from those technologies in terms of new market entries, new product development, new time to market, and so on. And there is no secret. The developed world is not is not good, and the developing world is not good either. I want to finish on these numbers and saying who benefit again from this economy. What we find out is that, in fact, for one job, which is pretty much reallocated, pretty much 3 to 4 jobs could be created by the internet, simply because the internet opened new space and spaces where, especially in developing countries, there were no market existing. And that's, again, my last point, which is whatever numbers you're going to come on the internet, they tend to understate what the internet impact is on the economy, and I'm quite sure the panel will basically bridge on that. But the point is that a lot of things happen on the internet which are not yet measured in marketable numbers, i.e. if you go, like me, in Africa, and you start seeing people in Kenya, for instance, where the universe of their life is basically a 20-kilometer radius because they can only work 20 kilometers a day, and the only thing of their life will be defined by 20 kilometers. And the next day, they got a mobile from which a mobile data feed could basically give them an SMS to connect for the next 20 kilometers, or possibly the rest of the countries. Obviously, you got fascinating evolution, which does not translate yet into figures, but obviously will fundamentally change the market structure, the market dynamics of these countries.
Thank you very much, Jacques. I would like to ask Mike about the probably cultural and societal impact of that revolution that Jacques was talking about. Previously, Internet's been growing in Western countries, which share same cultural heritage. Now we are talking about BRICs and some other markets, which are as diverse within, than they're distant from, as they're distant from the Western Europe or the US. To what extent do you think that will matter in the development of internet economy and society in those countries?
For the last 10 years or so, we've been really asking ourselves the question, how will the web change the world? But to me, the most interesting question that we can now think about is actually the reverse, which is how will the world change the web? And if you look at it, there's still a huge bias to looking at Silicon Valley as the kind of center point for the internet revolution. But frankly, if you look at the numbers, today, 14% is what Americans represent on the World Wide Web. The vast majority of the internet already, in terms of numbers, is everywhere else. And what's interesting to me is when you look at those other markets, it's not just to look at them in terms of economics or statistics and say, there's 1 billion people in China, that's a big internet market. But it's to actually look at what is the potential for cultural innovation. If you look at the real history of the internet and the things that we use every day, they had a lot of their origins in places you might not expect. So Facebook did not invent social networking. It actually came from Korea. world. And it arose out of the very hierarchical, structural way that Koreans look at their relationships with their families and friends. Zynga didn't invent social gaming. It came from, once again, China and Japan. The first people to do mobile content was not the Swedish. It was the Japanese, because if you ride a subway in Japan, it's very crowded. So you're sitting here, you can't read a newspaper. It's just enough room to read on your phone. Now, arguably, in Russia, your unique situation, which is immense amounts of piracy and a lack of desire to pay for things, has led to other forms of innovation. So really, Russians on websites here pioneer freemium models, you know, the use of upgrades, you know, to drive business models. And you see this, perhaps unfortunately, on websites that have now been exported globally, like Badoo and Mamba. But in a ways, they are also forms of innovation in business models. But it's interesting, I think, to compare the differences between some of these BRICs. So there are some similarities between markets like China and Russia. In both China and Russia, you've been protected to some extent. So Russia was protected for many years because of language, Cyrillic, and also because maybe a lack of attention by Western players. China was protected by its government and the Great Wall of China that blocked Twitter and Facebook from entering. But I think going forward, Russia is going to be in an interesting position because you don't have those same protections. If you're going to survive now in this market, you have to survive by being fast and innovative because the big players are now coming. But what I think is going to happen is that in all these markets, the rules of engagement are very different. This is not just about Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It's also about Indonesia, about Turkey, about Mexico. And the internet in these markets is completely different to what it is in the West. I've spent a bit of time in Indonesia, and I was really quite shocked because when I arrived there, I was introduced to the guy who is apparently the father of the internet in Indonesia. And before anyone can look at the web in Indonesia, it all has to pass through this tiny server room in Jakarta, which this guy controls. And when he showed me, he said, I'm going to show you the most important thing in all of Indonesia. And bear in mind that Indonesia is like the second largest Facebook user market in the world. He showed me this big group of blue cables, and they all had little white labels on all of them. And on all the blue cables were marked Facebook, Twitter, Yahoo, Google, eBay, Amazon. And he said to me, I'm going to show you something really cool. I said, what? He says, I'm going to take down Facebook for all of Indonesia for 30 seconds. And I was like, you can't do that. He said, sure I can. I do it all the time. He goes, everyone thinks the internet's really unreliable here. It's just me pulling out cables. And it really struck me that, you know, the big brands in the world who think they can just dominate other markets remotely from a server in California have got a big shock coming because when I look at the future of these new markets, it's very much about local knowledge, local understanding, and more importantly, it's about new platforms like mobile. So the vast majority of people, whether they're in rural Russia or in Indonesia or in Africa, their first experience of the internet will be on their phone, not a PC. And it's interesting because when I asked someone in Indonesia, he said he did the biggest survey in Indonesia that he asked people about whether they use the internet or not. And he said almost all of them said no. He said, but when they asked whether or not they use Facebook, he said they all said yes. And he said it's because they thought that Facebook was just a button on their phone. So this to me is the big lesson. If we look at the web in 10 years' time, it'll look very different to what we experience today. We won't go on the internet. The internet will never leave us. But it'll be primarily, the growth will come from these new markets, and it'll be primarily on mobile.
Thank you very much, Mike. I would like to move to Leonid. Leonid is uniquely positioned to talk about entrepreneurship and companies in those countries. To what extent do you think something that Mike was talking about on protection of local markets, development of local companies, and local knowledge affects the entrepreneurship and growth of companies in the internet economy in these countries?
I'm going to speak Russian, although it's very difficult to switch to Russian after the first two speakers. Well, but I'll try to. Well, actually, we do understand what is going on in emerging markets, and I believe the markets which are really interesting from the viewpoint of business, internet business, are not only the BRIC countries, the traditional 4 countries, because very interesting things take place in such regions as Southeast Asia and specifically Indonesia, which is one of the largest countries in the world by population. Besides, we see very dynamic development in Turkey, and if in Nigeria people wouldn't shoot each other from time to time, Nigeria could become one of the leading internet development countries as well. One difference can be noted, however. Russia is one of the most advanced countries from the viewpoint of the following. We have free competition, and in all niches, in all services, Russian companies are leaders, and global international companies are number 2 or number 3 in almost all niches except Twitter. The same situation is in China, but in China you can really see government protection, government assistance, which doesn't allow some of the players in the market like Google, Facebook and Twitter to become serious players in that country. In Russia, competition is free, open, unrestricted, and this is very important. In Russia, businessmen and companies which exist locally are the local leaders. Another important point is as follows. It's important for many emerging markets. Internet as an industry is developing so fast that the difference between the services and the changing lifestyle in the emerging markets and in the mature Western countries, so the gap is becoming smaller and smaller with every passing year. Many traditional industries can lag behind, but internet as an industry is developing so fast that the gap is insignificant between developed and developing world. As I say, I'm talking about services and quality of service only. I'm not talking about the size of the market. I'm not talking about the money. Because if we take Vietnam, for instance, which is an interesting and promising country, because it has 90 million people living there and highly developed mobile services. But last year, all the advertising market was about $25 million only. $30 million. It's nothing. It's negligible. But from the viewpoint of services and the influence of those services on the everyday life, internet is accelerating the whole thing. It changes the lifestyle in emerging countries. Another interesting point, on the one hand, large countries with a lot of population, with large populations, with huge markets, well, out of 10 entrepreneurs who want to start their businesses, 9 are going to look for analogs somewhere in the US or in Europe to clone that template, because by cloning the previous experience you can earn a lot of money and build their own business, because the markets are rather large, voluminous. If we look at small countries, Israel, the Nordic countries, they don't have such an opportunity. As a result, 8 or 9 entrepreneurs out of 10 do not think about cloning anything, because markets are narrow, and they think about inventing something totally new, something what we call innovative. And this is the difference between young people and their attitude to new startup businesses. There is nothing bad in the clones or in the innovative approach. Clones give you fast return of investment, fast proliferation of good business models. It helps economy to develop. It gives you an opportunity to develop. But from the point of view of innovation, mentality in large countries is different from those of small countries. And the last point, perhaps, I would like to stress. I saw quite an unusual thing for me in all the countries where we work. We work in 10 countries. Apart from Russia, most of them are emerging markets of Asia and South Africa. I was startled by the high level of management. I mean average level. That is quite high. If you meet an entrepreneur, the CEO, the founder of a certain company in Indonesia, Thailand, or India, or Turkey, then on average, he is a highly skilled manager. There is a big trend. Young people got education in Europe or in the US. They come back to their native countries and start businesses. It's not something rare. It's massive influx of highly skilled, highly educated youngsters who come back to their native countries with skills, with knowledge, and when you see them, when you see their teams, you realize that very often they are not naive at all. They realize very well what they have to do, how they are going to develop their enterprise environment. They work hard. And I can say that if we take average level of managerial skills, Russia is lagging behind. So Russia has excellent entrepreneurs with excellent ideas, working hard, but if we take the average level, if we take the average comprehension of corporate management styles, the right foundation, right construction of the companies, Russia is lagging behind. That's generally is what I wanted to say to begin with. Thank you very much. We're ready to start the Q&A session. You are free to ask questions through Twitter or through the microphones. If you have mobile access devices that we mentioned, you can use them, or you can take the microphone. Have you got any questions, please?
I want to take again some build on your comments, because I think they are a very important comment in terms of entrepreneurship and the way the developing, aspiring world of the BRIC countries will develop versus the US. First of all, I think we all know that constraints exist, access to capital, possibly the establishment of the infrastructure. But again, it's only one part of one face of the coin. The exciting face of the coin is the other one, which is that actually in markets like new development countries, the fact that many industries are actually not existing create a fascinating opportunity to create new business model based on the internet. Again, take again the infrastructure, and you are in countries like Africa. The fixed infrastructure does not exist. In most of the market today, mobile penetration is starting to be up to 70%, like in Kenya and so on. But again, that means that if tomorrow you decide to build a business model on mobile data based on OTT application like WhatsApp, the cannibalization effect against the classical telecom incumbent, yes, will exist, but it's likely to be slightly smaller in magnitude than it is in Europe. That means that there is more potential for you to deploy these kind of business models. Think about the fact that banking does not exist. If it does not exist and you can create mobile banking like M-Pesa in Africa, you can basically get a huge fringe of the population which was not in the marketplace because of lack of banking capabilities or relationship to be bankable. And all this opportunity exists because the market was not existing, and the internet technology gives this new opportunity. So the interesting thing is that, yes, as far as that constraints, there are new interesting opening gates coming from the internet, which is unheard of, both because the market were not existing, and especially because the old market structure is not fighting back or trying to retain the gates or close the gate to make sure they still have the profit pool. And that's quite important. In this environment, you come very quickly to two consequences. Very first one, entrepreneurship is what matters. Find the new business model that will give you the new market from which you can make money or basically develop something from the society point of view is going to be quite key. Two, it's likely not going to be the copycat of the Western world which is going to fly. It's likely to be very specific business models that is pretty much tailored to the type of market structure, market dynamics that you're facing in those countries that will be the winner business model. So I'm actually pretty exciting. And again, the work we've done with Google, we were just extremely, we took the wrong hypothesis, obviously, as Westerners, of saying, we believe the way to catch up will take time. And in fact, we were pretty surprised to find so many local entrepreneurs with exciting business models that are likely to revolutionize most of the markets in aspiring countries. And the pace at which they develop, the pace at which they will nurture new markets, it's actually not it's not heard of. And I also believe it's quite exciting.
The third piece is actually interesting as well, which is that do those new market-breaking models developed for local situations can then break out and influence the developed world?
Well, let me pick up on that. And also, both you and Leonid mentioned this. Leonid said 9 companies out of 10 in the local market will do local copycats. But then there is 10% of the entrepreneurs.
No, I said differently. I said that 9 entrepreneurs are thinking about to take a good model, and maybe 1 out of 10 doing and dreaming to do something very different.
Global and new. And Mike mentioned a number of examples of that coming out of Korea or Japan, but also Russia. What actually prevents these companies from going global? Why these ideas actually flourish into the global companies, not in Korea, but in Silicon Valley, being copycat by Silicon Valley entrepreneurs? Why won't Korean Facebook take over the world?
I believe it's a lot to do with the inability to change filters easily. Cyworld made a number of attempts to launch in America, and they failed. NTT Docomo tried to bring iMode long before iTunes to the world. They failed. And generally what happens is that you have a lot of success in your local market, and you just try and replicate that elsewhere without adapting it. And you'll often get smart entrepreneurs who are influenced by what they see elsewhere, but they can kind of customize it to the local context. And it's a very rare company, I think. And to some extent, global players like Google and Facebook have been successful in that. But sometimes it's as much luck and art as it is science and planning.
It's also you can actually reverse Leonid's argument, saying that maybe if you take a Korean or Japanese model into the US, then US market size really matters. And if you adopt a US market size, then you create a company which is so successful that it can easily go
It is, but sometimes it's accidental. I mean, Orkut didn't work anywhere except for Brazil.
Right.
And apparently the reason why it took off in Brazil was also accidental, because when they handed out invitations, they gave 200 people 50 invitations each. J.P. Barlow from the Grateful Dead, as a joke, gave it all to Brazilians. It wasn't very funny for Google, though, when when it ended up being the kind of the over-index point in terms of the network structure.
Yes, Leonid, you wanted to add something?
Но я хотел сказать, что
I'd like to say that we have some business models. It doesn't mean that we import everything we can from the US. We have some business models that came to us from Europe or were developed locally, but they are quite few. It's the flash sale model, which came from France, Skype, from Estonia and the Nordics. Besides, we have a rep model coming from Sweden. Then some Russian models include Badu, developed by Mr. Andreev, a model developed here in Russia. It happens from time to time, but not as often as we can say. The models which come from Sweden, Israel, Finland, Sweden prove your previous argument that this is a small market and we have more people living in Moscow than in Sweden, and they try to innovate. It would be interesting to say how Badu and other companies got success worldwide.
Argument of the long tail versus the head of the distribution. You talk now about the head of the distribution, i.e., do we got these companies that are becoming rising stars and can they be localized and globalized? Again, the web tells you that there is a long tail of companies, and again, Alvariance, as the chief economics of Google, has also a name for these companies called the micro multinationals, which actually are doing a lot to the economy. I mean, there are small companies of 10 to 25 people who basically leverage the web extensively for selling products on the e-commerce sites and the like. These companies are creating employment. These companies are creating exports and are basically creating wealth for for a lot of those countries. So again, we should not be biased in saying we all here to find out the new golden goose and the new Yandex in those markets. That's part of the economy. But again, in all findings, what we find out is that 25% of the economic activities linked to the wealth creation is driven by the supply side, i.e. the new Yandex of these words, but 75% is actually very small enterprise trying to leverage its technologies to make a business model out of it, or simply using them to accelerate the path to markets, and obviously a few big companies that are trying to use that for multi-channels, for new innovation, and so on. So that's one aspect that we should not forget. Then there is another aspect, which is the talent base. And again, the talent base is also it's quite important to understand. Why? Because most of these companies, when they're becoming big and they go international, what they lack most of the time is the market insight, the marketing capabilities, the scalability. The scalability exists in the platform, but not necessarily in the business processes. And the same thing, if you look in the small enterprise and the like, what they lack most of the time is talent to leverage these technologies. So I think one major theme as well that we need to possibly talk about is small versus large enterprise, but also how is talent going to be distributed to benefit from this evolution?
Разговаривая про таланты.
Well, talking about talents, we can get a lot of questions. Where can we take managers from? Why Russian managers are so unskilled? Why our universities cannot graduate good managers? I can answer this question. It's important. What I said, education. education has very little to do with this problem. We have good education system in Russia, we have wise people in this country, but what we see in reality in the area of management is investments. The more investment we have, the more CEOs have to interact with the people who see a lot of other experiences and ways, who really understand how the company has to be structured to attract investments, what the CEO or the founder has to do in the company for the company to attract investments, good investments, and potentially go to IPO. This is a high school of real life that entrepreneurs go through together with investors. It's an important issue. We spend much more time in Russia for interaction with our partners who launched their startups in order to explain to them very simple things, because those people didn't have experience of interaction with other stakeholders, investors, shareholders, who require transparency, who need understanding, awareness of certain details. Many entrepreneurs look at it as, for them, that is something new. The more investments we have, the more investors we have, the faster we shall raise the average level of skills among our entrepreneurs and managers. Very often we see strong managerial skills in emerging markets. Why? Because they worked in the Silicon Valley for some time, or in Europe. They saw real investors. They saw how financial reports must be provided. They know everything about analytics and corporate structure. They know that they have to have a powerful CFO or chief accountant. They know they have to provide monthly reports and analytics by certain standards, not only for tax inspection, but for investors as well. And they need it not only for the sake of investors, but for the sake of their company as well. And this awareness comes with time, with experience. Investors are a very good locomotive of this development. The more investment, the better is the managerial skill.
Well, how do you think it's a question of time? Maybe Russia is still a young country, so that people have not yet had the time to come back. Or maybe Russia has other opportunities for talented managers, such as CFOs, maybe in the public sector rather than in a commercial company or startup, or maybe in the raw materials sector where the revenues are quite high? Or is it all about closeness, being closed, so the society being too proud of what we have and just don't want to listen to those people who come back from abroad? Or is it just a matter of time? Well, I think it's a matter of time, and also a matter of investment attractiveness of the country as a whole. So saying that our investment attractiveness is not sufficient, and one has to improve something. But this is all about institutional issues, so it doesn't have to do with any particular company. And why is it happening? It has nothing to do with what people have been taught to do. In many ways, it's about the practical and business experience that they have and that they see around them. Because if they see, like, if the founder is very young, for instance, he or she is like 22 or 25, they started their business, and They just don't have enough life experience to build a corporate environment that matches the success they want to achieve as a company. But maybe if there's an environment around them with other entrepreneurs, other companies that have moved further down the line, so this particular young founder could see that. So if the environment is such that there are a lot of investors in the market, so he or she would also see that and perceive that. This experience. We all know that graduating from a university is just a starting point. But then you're getting into real life. You start accumulating life experience, business experience that will or will not raise you to a whole different height. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. A question. Perhaps we need a microphone to make sure that the interpretation is done. I'll ask. Well, then, if you speak English, then you need translation to Russian. Hello. Vasily Kapov, RIA Novosti Media Laboratory. It's half question, half opinion. Thing is that Russia, as opposed to many other countries, sees a lack of mid-size investment capital. So business angels that provide pennies are there. Investors like yourself, Leonid, are there. So these are the people who are looking at companies with a substantial potential. But in the middle, apart from fast lane ventures, there's nothing else. There's nothing. So this is the first consideration, and maybe it's a question out into the air. Because people who have those 10 to 20 million to play with, they prefer to buy a house in France and to forget forever that they've ever lived here. So this is to the question of investment attractiveness of the country. And the second idea, which is more to do with the potential, isn't that the Russian internet market has one big drawback. It's very skewed, very biased towards two very large companies. And perhaps it's even more biased than the American one is towards 5 large companies, because they have 5 big companies that take care of 75% of the revenues, and we have 2 large companies that provide 90% of the revenue. And we don't have a PayPal to balance it. Well, I'm not referring to PayPal as a company, but as a result, impact of PayPal. So Peter Silly and his colleague who has cashed in on the privatization of PayPal. So many thanks to you that you exist. But are you expecting that your colleagues from Yandex are going to start actively investing, for instance? Well, 2 very difficult questions, Leonid, you'll have to answer. But I mean, 10 to 20 million would be enough to buy a small castle in France. And unless you need 2 castles, maybe you'll find another 10, 20 million that you'll be able to invest in Russia. But there's also a Russian venture company, which has this mandate as well. Leonid, you're welcome. Well, there are several aspects, important aspects. You start speaking and the sound will come up. So there are several important aspects here. Firstly, there are not so many interesting projects in Russia, to be frank. Yes, I understand it's a chicken and egg problem. I also agree with the interesting comment to the effect that the dominating 2, maybe not 2, but 3 or 4 companies are, on the one hand, a good thing, because this company can potentially become strategists for startups and young companies. But on the other hand, indeed, we do see, if not a monopoly, but the market is mostly split between large players. And what we've seen recently, well, interesting projects do emerge, but there are very few of them. In terms of money, I don't believe that there's not enough money in the Russian market for investment. And today, we have plenty of venture companies that are actually prepared to enter the projects that they find interesting at any phases. From the very initial phases, when they can donate, when they can contribute several $100,000 to further stages down the line when they can provide $20 to $30 million per transaction. Yes, I can say that in such countries as Turkey, the interest on the part of the venture capital is on the whole larger than to Russia. And what we all know when we discuss, that is the image of Russia, the investment attractiveness of Russia for Western funds, it's all quite unsatisfactory, I would say. That is, I talk a lot with American and European investors, and a phrase that I always hear, what they say is, with everything else equal, I'd rather invest in Brazil than in Russia. So if there are two interesting projects and they have to decide where to invest, they prefer Brazil rather than Russia. So the question is why? To the question of why, they usually answer quite simply, risks. They believe that risks in Russia are larger than in Brazil. Thank you. We have some general questions.
Pretty much on the same line. One is can Russian companies compete globally? Are we catching up or lagging behind the US? And will local companies exist and succeed, or global companies will crowd out the local companies and local copies, local copycats? So simple answers, yes or no, to both questions. Huh?
I think it requires a PhD thesis of 5 years to get there. Oh, by the way, I've got a house in France, so if you want to buy it for 20 million, I'm totally happy with it. No, joking apart, again, this question is a bit too broad. There are just tons, and it relates to the answer to the question of venture capital and the like. Ask yourself the question slightly differently. You go to Africa, I'm just amazed to see the flow of new business ideas in Africa versus the one I see in my work in Russia, despite the fact that if you're in Africa, I will tell you, the venture funds are pretty much not existing, and the societal aspects of investing in the web is hugely complex, i.e., you are, if you're an entrepreneur in Africa, you are with your family of 5, 6, 7 kids, your wife does not work, and if you take the plunge to take the risk of building a new cause, you have no revenue to survive, while at the same time your average revenue per capita is actually close to the threshold of poverty. So how do you do that? Well, these guys went there, did develop, because they develop interesting local business model that they can scale. Now, I'm not saying I haven't seen a lot here, but on top of my head, we could do the same list today with all of us and brainstorm and crowdsource business ideas. But, look at the resource that you have in this country. Now, I haven't seen a marketplace or an online information marketplace for trading woodlocks, for instance. I haven't seen something which is amazingly more efficient in the way to deliver, luxury products like caviar. I'm quite sure it exists, but yet I haven't seen the business model linked to that. And I think the first question here is to say, it's not a question, how do you compete globally? You always compete globally from a competitive advantage in the first place. So define to me what the competitive advantage is, scale it correctly to say whether you can be global in terms of the global taste or whatever else. And then the question is not, are you keeping up with the States? Are you different with the States is the key question.
I think there is a global dimension, though, that has to be faced, which is that for Russian companies, they've got one of two choices. They can either create something innovative that's world-class, like cut the rope,
yes,
or they find a way to target Russians in other markets. And it seems odd, but I mean, one of the candidates running for re-election as mayor in London recently set up an account in Chinese on Weibo, which is the Chinese Twitter. And it's not because he's got aspirations for the Beijing Communist Party, but it's because he's targeting a very large community of Chinese people living in London. So the diaspora populations are actually very significant. And I know there are some companies in Russia like Mail.ru that are starting to look at this opportunity. But if you think this is what's happening in Latin America, there are a lot of businesses that might have started in Argentina that are now having a very big influence throughout Mexico and sort of the Spanish-speaking countries, because they've managed to use culture as a rocket to really expand very quickly into new territories.
Thank you.
Мне кажется, что я вот такой интересный пример.
Well, I'll give a very interesting example. We have an investment in a company that's called Tradeshift. Well, initially, it was a Danish company. So in Denmark, well, the developers in Denmark built a service like that. It's basically a software as a service solution that allows in the cloud to create electronic accounts and to make orders. This is a very interesting and dynamically growing company that that initially shifted their headquarters to London, because in Denmark, because of what we have been discussing, it's very difficult. Like if you want to become global, it's very difficult to have a headquarters in Denmark. But more recently, they moved from London to Silicon Valley. The point is that today we have a perception, and this perhaps is something that we'll have to take for granted, such that if you want to be a global company in the digital world, you better be an American company if you want to be global. It just makes it easier, simpler to raise capital, and it's much easier to do a lot of other things. Even though in Silicon Valley, it's not easy at all to find good people, good employees. We also have a couple of investments in companies that were started by Russian guys, but they moved their headquarters to the Silicon Valley, while the R&D teams in many ways still exist in Russia. But the way they're positioning themselves to the market is as an American company. More than that, they try to do everything possible. So they're showing that technology-wise, it's built by Russians, talented people, because it's recognized all over the world. But as sales and marketing, and as far as business development, as far as investment relations is concerned, they position themselves as an American company. So in answer to the question of whether a Russian company, and let me add, with a headquarters in Moscow can become a global company, well, that would be very hard. Well, I'm not saying that it's impossible, but in our area, it's very difficult. By the way, it's interesting that Yandex is now making quite an important experiment. Yandex has started Turkish search, has launched Turkish search, and it's a very important and maybe a historic experiment. I must say that the audience is growing quite well in Turkey for Yandex. Yandex launched a very good search there. They launched Yandex traffic jams, which is very important in Istanbul. And yeah, this is important. So let's, all of us, support our Russian company that is making this move towards globalization. Thank you. There was a question there. Well, thank you very much. Yuri Pogorelov, Interfax. I have a question to Mike for the most part, because we don't have a lot of time left to the end of the session. Mike, what do you think about the business model in mass media? probably mostly about local media in local languages. Will they be able to survive in the future? Will they have to play a role of the second and third option in advertising budgets? So they first will award everything to large global services such as Facebook, then to local, like pictures and mail.ru, and only then to these poor newspapers where the whole staff will maybe confined to 2 or 3 people, freelancers, in 5 years. What are you feeling about that?
It's a tough question. Which in many ways was probably decided 5 years ago already. Yeah. So my view is for news reporting is very expensive to do if it's quality. And if it's bad, it's commoditized. So the challenge is going to be if you're a local newspaper. If your local newspaper was a blog, would anyone read it? And if they do read it, would you make any money from it? I think in the future, big news organizations that are well-known global brands will survive, and they'll thrive on multiple forms of media because they'll stop thinking of themselves as a physical medium. They'll just see themselves as a brand on multiple mediums. In the local space, I think news organizations will have to change significantly. They will have a lot less staff, they'll be a lot more nimble, and they'll have to find new ways to make money. But it will also depend on the category. In many ways, entertainment and gossip now has been crowdsourced to consumers. They can come up with much more interesting things on a Facebook feed than you can get on, e-news. And I think in particular on the Russian internet, just from my viewing this week, you have a lot of entertainment. Whether it's fake videos of Putin in cages or Pussy Riot or whatever it is. I mean, you have a lot of very free entertainment on the internet. I think it's hard to compete with. But seriously, I think the changes in media have already happened. And now it's just a question of advertisers following consumer behavior shifts.
But when you say local, do you think it's national level, city level, quartier level, district level, whatever?
In the old days, Warren Buffett said he loved investing in newspapers because he could, if he saw that the population of a local town was increasing, then revenues would increase on the newspaper. So I think the biggest victim is going to be at the city level. Mm-hmm. To some extent, national newspaper and media outlets can survive as global brands. But really, the smaller the level of localization, the greater the damage.
Okay. И у нас есть время еще для одного вопроса. Да, пожалуйста.
And we have some time for another question. Yes, you're welcome. Well, hello, Tatiana Lipatova, Internet Agency of Ticket Sales. Talking about the specificity of the Internet market in Russia, they often say that since someone has first entered the Internet, they will only make their first purchase in 3 years from that. So there's no trust to using bank cards, so you have to sign up, share your data. There are a lot of myths about fraud. So I'd like to hear a comparison about the situation in other countries where the internet is growing as fast and the number of users growing. How fast will the user go this way, building trust? Are there any ways to fight those myths and superstitions? And before you...
Question. Can you also consider the question on Twitter, how you would compare Russia to other BRIC countries in terms of general internet and e-business proficiency, because it's directly related to that question. Yes, please.
Maybe on the first one, in terms of the statistics, we measure, at least at the small medium enterprises, we compare the Russian companies versus the average SMB in Europe and in the US. What we find out in terms of distribution is that companies like Russian companies, barely 10 to 15% of small medium enterprise can leverage the web extensively, and 85 pretty much don't. And there's even a long tail of 40% that really don't. If you compare that to the US, it's much more. 30% are really using it extensively and correctly, and you have a long tail of 20 to 30%. So you see a real shift of an order of magnitude of 1 to 2. So that's quite important. Now, on your question on e-commerce, there are always pain points, but pain points define business models too. The good news about the e-commerce is that in every market in the world, 20 years ago or 10 years ago, when e-commerce started, it took roughly 18 months for somebody coming for the first time on the internet to start doing a transaction. In your case, it's possibly 3 years, so it's a bit too long. But at the end of the day, what we find out is that when people do their first transaction, usually there is no way back. So the question is possibly a timing question, much more than anything else. Now, trust, infrastructure for trust and the like will develop no matter what in those countries, like it has done in other markets. The reason, a brand like eBay or Amazon can stand as they are is that at the end of the day, they command a price premium of trust. If you go to Amazon value proposition is you buy something, you trust that you will get the goods that you want to get in the timely fashion. If you don't like it, you can return back. And that has a value which basically gives the value of the price discount or the price benefit that you can get against the offline. Now, that means companies need to build that trust and build possibly part of the infrastructure. Yes, it will possibly take time, but relax. I also believe in every market I've seen, and again, take the example of Latin America, where e-commerce was pretty much rampant and, to say the least, even non-existent. By a few innovations, by changing a bit of the rules, i.e., when there is a fraud, the burden of the fraud is not on the consumer but on the bankers, and so on, which has changed dramatically the process of trust. So I guess a few things like that could possibly create a marketplace. So yes, maybe it will take time, but hang on there. I'm quite sure it's going to develop.
If you look at all the BRICs, they all have problems with e-commerce, and it's not just about development. I mean, even Germany, they hate credit cards. You go to Media Market, you can't pay with a credit card either. But to me, what's going to happen is one of two things. You'll either use retail stores, like in China, where you buy vouchers that you can use in gaming, or you do what is happening in Russia, which is being linked to mobile SMS.
Exactly.
And the mobile becomes the trusted platform for payment.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Leonid?
Well, briefly, to answer this question, then Russia. I'm actually answering this question about the effectiveness of e-commerce in BRIC countries. Russia is certainly not number one. I believe Brazil is number one. In Brazil, more than 80% of transactions in e-commerce are happening using plastic cards, whereas in this country, it's mostly cash on delivery. And logistics. The logistical infrastructure in Brazil is much more advanced. And to your question, I'm answering that recently we've seen a considerable speeding up, the reduction of time to the first purchase in the internet. And strange as it may seem, I think coupon services have played a role there, because in coupon services there's no delivery of both the coupon and cash acceptance in your home, so people have to pay using some payment service, either card or Kiwi, and because some attractive propositions have been made, there are a lot of people who made their first internet purchases thanks to coupon sales. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank all the participants and the audience. Thank you very much.